This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Double bumper episode, patrons. Hello, it's Emerald Moon here. That's Tom Ballard.
Hello.
This is Serious Danger, podcast about green politics in Australia. Also the podcast where we go inside the Greens with the help, of course, of our wonderful producer, Michael the Griffin, behind the scenes. Behind the scenes, inside the Greens, we will talk more. We've been going through the listener survey results, and one thing we know from what the listeners have told us is that you hate inside the Greens and you love inside the Greens, and you want more and less of it at the same time.
So you want a realistic, down-to-earth show that's completely off the wall and swarming with magic robots.
That's right. Yeah.
Good. And also, you should win things by watching.
It was very cute. Some of the feedback was, I haven't listened to them yet because I want them to finish the whole book and then I'll go through it all in one hit. I'm like, okay, is that an excuse that you tell someone that when you go and listen to their podcast? Or are our listeners such fucking nerds that they would actually do that? And they would spend more than a day that it will take you to listen to all this podcast series.
Also, like the number of people whose responses were like, what do I often skip the Inside the Greens episodes, but I know I shouldn't. And actually, I'm going to go back and listen right now. And it's like, well, this isn't homework. No one, you don't have to listen to this.
Just live your life, guys. We're just reading a book over here. We don't mind. We're fine.
But yeah, like instead of, I thought maybe it would be good actually to just get through the chapters more quickly, so the people who want to listen to the whole thing can listen to the thing. We don't need to break it up necessarily, and the people who don't want to listen to it don't need to listen to it. And we will always have other content going, but we have much to talk about because shit is getting good. We're at the point, like I think, Tom, you said last time, we're kind of at the point where we have sentience as human beings and we remember some of these things as we were
We're
growing
millennials,
up.
so it gets interesting when we're involved and we're there.
This is when it gets really interesting.
So now we care.
Right.
Yeah,
I feel like this is when, I don't know, the world just started kind of being more good and interesting. We are doing the second part of Chapter 8, Taking a Stand. The first half was juicy enough before we even got into the second half. Give us a quick recap, Tom.
We were talking about the period from the 2004 election. The Iraq War was very big indeed. The Greens were growing. We had a New South Wales state election where we started getting attacked for our horrific drug policy, of course.
Oh, yeah.
That's about to loom its ugly head very shortly as well.
Yes.
You'll be pleased to know. And we talked about the big moment when Bob Brown and Kerry Nettle, thank you to the people for picking us up. We did not mean to erase Kerry Nettle in our social media posts.
Nettle erasure, yeah.
She was also there, not heckling George Bush, but simply speaking when he was speaking and trying to have a fair conversation with him, interrupting him on David Hicks, the war on terror and fair trade or free trade, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, yes, very juicy. And I see you've added a little bit more of an insight into what happened with the heckling Bush thing.
I was looking up because I was searching for the exact words because people said, well, what did he say? We did this clip about how no one asked what he said. And I found an article from Green Left Weekly from the 29th of October 2003 on the event itself that included Bob's actual words. And it also includes this section, which I was like, interesting. I will quote, in an October 23 press release, Democrats leader Andrew Bartlett called the Greens protest, quote, stupid, disrespectful, and counterproductive. Bartlett was a poor judge of the reception that Brown and Nettle's actions would receive. And for anyone listening who doesn't know why I thought this was interesting is because Andrew Bartlett later became a Greens senator.
He sure did. And he also has some thoughts in this chapter as well, not only about that heckling incident, but about the Greens generally and how radical they are. This is when he was still in the Democrats, and then, of course, would eventually end up being Queensland Senator for the Greens. He wasn't in there for long, though, was he?
No, so he was the replacement after Larissa was accidentally Canadian.
Right.
So when all of this Section 44 constitutional stuff was happening, and starting with, I believe Scott Ludlam was the first, right, where he was like, I just found out I'm not eligible to sit in the Senate because I have dual citizenship. He resigned, and then Larissa was soon after that because she was unfortunately Canadian. She's no longer Canadian. She whatever, denounced that citizenship, and so she's back in now. But yeah, in that intervening period, Andrew Bartlett was the Queensland Greens senator.
Right.
But I don't know and maybe we'll get there in Inside the Greens. Like, I'm curious to see the Andrew Bartlett journey to go from seemingly quite a strident critic of the Greens when he was in the Democrats to then being a Greens senator.
Interesting. I mean, look, we must be real. There are people who are in the Greens today who, if a similar protest would happen today, would also make similar comments. And not just Andrew Bartlett.
No, but but he's saying although maybe even his other comments, it's true. They're the kind of things that there are people who are, notional Green supporters who don't agree with the more radical side of things, I guess.
That'll come up. All right, so the first, I think I said 2004 election before. I meant the 2001 election. We're about to kick off with the 2004 election.
Yes.
Also lots of other stuff happening in the rest of this chapter. We've got guns making appearance in Tasmania, the issue of party leadership, the term neoliberals on bikes will be used.
Oh, yeah.
And we are heading towards the 2007 federal election, which we have already done an episode on. We sort of did a deep dive on the 2007 federal election on a previous episode. So we'll talk a little bit about it in this chapter. But if you really want to go deep in Kevin 07, then you want to check out a previous episode. Episode 56, do we say?
The episode, it's another Patreon episode. It was episode 56, Patreon 56, 2007 election special.
Sweet. All right, so picking up halfway through chapter number 8, taking a stand, and we are heading towards the 2004 election. Simon Crean is the leader of the Labor Party. We don't like this. The ALP doesn't like this. Nobody really likes this. And in December 2003, he gets replaced by one Mark Latham, who, to his credit, and I've read some quotes of Mark Latham, he has occasionally said some good things. The balance of things sort of work out.
Yeah, I mean,
to not
the scales are slightly towards bad, but, yeah.
But at this point was quite notable for criticising John Howard's relationship to the US and his support for the war on terror, which was based on a lie. And the war in Iraq cost, on some estimates, up to 1 million lives. So I'll give credit to you, Mark. It called John Howard an arse licker for sucking up to Bush and the coalition a conga line of suckholes, which I think is better. It's better than I Want to Do You Slowly by Paul Keating. That's my take.
Good.
I think it's a better line.
I would like to say nothing wrong with arse licking or hole sucking. Just to be clear, as we've been accused of kink shaming on the show recently, and I just want to make that abundantly clear. However, talking shit on Howard for sucking up to Bush is good.
That's good. So here's this big move. Latham, as this new leader, has this move where he pre-selects a gentleman by the name of Peter Garrett for the very safe Labor seat of Kingsford Smith.
Can I tell you a secret?
Yes.
You and everyone else listening. That I maybe shows how disengaged with politics I still was at this point. I thought Peter Garrett, somehow in my mind, I thought Peter Garrett was actually a Greens MP and resigned from the Greens and joined Labor. Because all I'd ever heard it presented as was probably the words were he was a Greenie and then he defected and went to Labor. But now I learn, after reading this chapter, thanks Paddy Manning, that it was just that he was a small G Green and then he became a Labor MP. Yeah.
Well, we briefly saw Peter pop up in this book earlier on when we were talking about the anti-nuclear movement and the NDP, the Nuclear Disarmament Party in WA. Peter was involved in that party and was certainly with Joe Valentine.
Joe, who we spoke to.
Yes. Was I there? No, I wasn't there.
Right. Okay.
But I still love and respect Joe Valentine. But yes, she was involved with the NDP, and Peter Garrett was also involved in that party, but got driven out by the trots and the entryism, apparently. Being involved there. So he was certainly there. And as Paddy Manning quotes in his 2015 memoir, Big Blue Sky, Peter Garrett gives his own account of his decision to join the ALP as opposed to the Greens or some other, environmental party. I was too much of an economic dry and too allergic to utopianism to side with the Australian Greens. Sanctimony sucks. And while there are a number of people involved with the party whom I liked and had worked with in the past, including Bob, I couldn't envisage years of playing a dishonest song to the bleachers, because he's a singer, promising a nirvana that couldn't be delivered and castigating everyone else as moral inferiors. In their eyes, Labor and Liberal were indistinguishable from one another. As a way of slicing votes, it was effective rhetoric, but a long way from the truth. On environmental issues like climate change, the differences were great, which explain why, in nearly all cases, the Greens would exchange preference votes with Labor, the party they spent most time attacking. They wanted Labor to stay in power, but they also wanted to enlist the support of left-oriented Labor supporters. It was a deft double act, but not one in which I wanted to participate.
Oh, there's so much in this.
Please.
There's so much in this. Oh, I obviously have been thinking a lot about the critique of people on the left who say that the major parties are the same or who spend time attacking Labor and all of that. There was the Abby Chatfield podcast interview with Anthony Albanese, and off the back of that, like a lot of people criticizing her for not criticizing Albanese enough, and then she's saying, well, it's bullshit when you say the major parties are the same. We need to talk about the differences. But I just one thing, for example, when Peter Garrett is like, oh, the Greens spend most of their time attacking Labor, the problem to my mind is not that people think that the major parties are the same. The problem is that the people think Labor and the Greens are the same. Like, so many voters, we come across this time and again, they're like, oh, yeah, maybe one Labor, Green 2, or one Green, 2 Labor. They actually distinguish so little between Labor and the Greens. So it is kind of incumbent on someone to talk about the distinctions between Labor and the Greens, for example, and I mean all of the parties, really, all of the candidates that are standing, not just the major parties, which is all that the mainstream media ever talk about, obviously. But the problem is then if you're trying to elucidate, like if you're trying to articulate distinctions between yourself and a party that you disagree with, you necessarily, like, it's going to come off as quote unquote attacking if you're just articulating something that you disagree with. Like, the thing is, if me saying Labor is approving new coal and gas is attacking Labor, then you don't support the approval of new coal and gas. That just means you don't support Labor. I just gave you information that's probably relevant. Yeah, like probably relevant for your vote. And that's something that's completely missing from discourse. And so it's not that, and maybe there are people who say this, and like I've probably said this as a joke, Labor and Liberal are the same. They've got the same donors. They're similar in many ways. Obviously, they're not the fucking same. Then there are many differences between Labor and Liberal. But the problem is that's all that's ever talked about. There is no lack of discussion about the differences between the major parties. There's a lack of discussion about the differences between the major parties and all the other parties that are there. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think particularly these days, at least, whenever that critique is being wheeled out by the Greens, people are pretty careful to say that on these certain issues, on these big issues, on so many issues, on an increasing number of issues, the two major parties, the Coles and Woolworths, the duopoly of politics, agree on so much. We're tricked into thinking that they're at each other's throats and they're diametrically opposed. But no, look at refugee policy, on accepting donations from the fossil fuel industry, on policy in regards to like our relationship to the US, for example. The taxing for the rich. I mean, there's small differences there, but they're both pretty up for cutting taxes as much as possible on rich people and corporations, on privatization, like all these things on which they do agree. Pointing that out is, yes, completely legitimate and important. And if you disagree with the Labor Party doing those stuff, well, guess what? You can try and join the Labor Party and change from within, Peter, but it didn't work out too well.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
What about the sanctimony element too? Because I'm a little bit torn on this, because as much as I can disagree with it and fulminate upon it on this podcast, I will also acknowledge that there is a perception of the Greens and of the left generally as being sanctimonious. Okay.
Yeah.
But I'm also like, I'm sorry, have you met someone from the Labor Party? Like,
I mean, that's true.
And I'm sorry, being in politics means saying what you believe in, saying that people that are fundamentally opposed to what you believe in are really wrong and bad. And when you're talking about the powerful people, like the heads of capital and people in the fucking coalition or in government, like, the terrible things that they are doing should outrage you. And it's completely understandable to have a whole bunch of rage aimed at those people. That's completely understandable. We don't want to be sanctimonious to our fellow citizens and to voters and people who happen to vote different ways. Sure, we can approach that. But the idea is that Labor Party is this place where just people are open to ideas and open to discussing things and consider all other points of view valid. I don't know, be a Greens member and have a chat to some members of the Labor Party, Peter, see how that goes.
Yeah. But you know what? Like, I mean, if Peter Garrett's saying, well, I'm allergic to utopianism and I don't want to promise a nirvana that can't be delivered, yeah, I guess you don't belong in the Greens because, like, fuck yeah, utopia. That's what I want. Like, yeah, I believe in a better world. I believe a better world is possible. That's why I'm in the fucking Greens. And I guess that's true. Like, that is part of the Greens philosophy and our platform, is that better things are possible.
And do you have a vision of the world? Like, if someone asked a Labor member, like, what? Oh, no, not a member necessarily, but an MP, right, or a Labor hack, big time. It's like, what is your vision of that better world? What does it look like? Is it democratic socialism, as your constitution says in your party? Or like what is actually the vision? You need to have some level of vision of a utopia or kind of idealized
I don't
world
think it
to work
is about.
towards.
I actually don't know. I think maybe that's the point, that rather than the idea of a better world, it's just small, it's incremental things. It's like, realpolitik kind of, pragmatic little tweaks. It's reformism, which is like, I'm not saying that that's inherently not valuable or worthwhile considering, like, but it's just a different thing. Yeah, like, I'm not sure that I could do politics if it wasn't based on the idea of a vision, of a big picture change. I don't know what that is for Labor.
Yeah. But also that, these are political ideas. The idea that what's the nirvana that the Greens want that can't be delivered? A
world where people have
welfare
a
system
home.
that covers everything, where people can live at home, where poverty doesn't exist. That's a nirvana that can't be delivered. Well,
genuinely, that's what. Yes, I think that's what a lot of people think. It can't be delivered.
Great response from Bob Brown in regards to Peter Garrett's decision. In an article for Green at the time, Bob Brown wrote that Garrett would be a great asset to the LP, but I do worry about Peter. He's going to have a hard time of it in the Labor Party. He's a very ethical man. He's been a real values person, a beacon of values in Australia. I can't think of anybody else who has as much potential and strength of character to be able to change a party from within, but I don't expect much change. The Greens build politics outside the old politics because when it comes to ecological wisdom or social equity, the old parties have long since gone off track and will not reform. No one individual, no matter how good, can change that. The ALP, now it has Garrett, needs to deliver. Peter would be much better off with the Greens. Our values on social justice, on the environment, are issues that Peter has been espousing very much through his music over many years.
It's a real neg, isn't it? Like, he's like being so nice to be. I mean, no one could say that he's not being really effusive about Peter there, but also being like, you fool.
Well, indeed. And with the benefit of hindsight, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Bob Brown does not miss. All right. Now, I really enjoyed this little nugget about Mark Latham sort of courting Bob Brown. I thought this was great. At the beginning of 2004, Latham had accepted an invitation from Bob Brown to visit the Tasmanian forests. Latham was no greenie, but had the view that a solid left-of-centre campaign should focus on 3 E's: education, the elderly, and the environment. Interesting. In his diaries, Latham wrote how much he liked Brown. Other than economic policy, our beliefs are quite similar. It's a shame that people like Bob Brown have been lost to the Labor Party. Brown tried again what had worked with Graham Richardson some 20 years earlier. He took Latham on a helicopter flight over the Styx Valley. The Labor leader scored it 5 out of 10, only the northern half worth saving.
He's like, yeah, it's mid.
Imagine saying that to Bob Brown.
I know.
Yeah. I wouldn't worry about saying too much of this.
Not that nice story. Yeah.
And Bob says that those trees down there, they're my family, mate. How about you fucking watch yourself?
How dare you?
After a walk through the neighbouring Valley of the Giants, however, Latham was stunned, rating it 10 out of 10. Great. Thanks for wheeling out your ratings here, Lark. Afterwards, Brown told journalist James Button he was dismayed at Latham's response, which was studied, desultory. He was not responding to me. It was as if he was saying, I'm not going to be shown to relate. Not just to me, but to the forests.
He wouldn't relate to the forests. Really rude. Really rude.
Anyway,
so how did that work out?
Yeah, it wasn't going to work out very well at all, and we'll explain why. But yes, Latham would later make a decision that people would not enjoy. He couldn't stand up for the forestry unions and supported the proposed Guns pulp mill, which will come up later in the chapter.
Yes, indeed.
Greens keep campaigning against Iraq throughout 2004. There's a 4% swing to the Greens, the Queensland state election, reaching 7% in 2004. Andrew Wilkie joins the party. He's still living in New South Wales at this point and becomes the Greens candidate in the seat of Bennelong, running against John Howard, which is kind of interesting. Howard would, of course, lose that seat in the 2007 election.
Again, see, I didn't know Andrew Wilkie was a Greens MP.
Yeah, I can't
I'm
remember why
learning
he
so much.
left the party. I'm sure we'll
We will
find out
probably
at some
learn.
point.
Yeah. Stay tuned.
But I don't think he won Denison as a Green. I could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that's right. I think he must have gone
Right.
independent. So he left. Something happened with the
Okay.
party.
So he wasn't a Greens MP. He was a
Yeah.
Greens candidate. And then, yeah, gotcha.
Yes. 2004, you've also got marriage equality playing around as an issue. In the States, in America, you got George Bush sort of weaponizing gay marriage going to the 2004 election. By mid-2004, Labor had gone to water on same-sex marriage, conceding some high moral ground to the Greens. The opposition had taken a softly approach to reform, championed by left-winger Anthony Albanese, steadily removing discrimination against same-sex couples, starting with superannuation law in 1996. In mid-2004, two gay and lesbian couples from Victoria applied to have their overseas marriages recognised by the family court. The Howard government moved immediately to prohibit same-sex marriages, enshrining in statute the common law definition that marriage could only occur between a man and a woman. With an election looming, Labor balked, voting in favour of Howard's amendments, so the country took a huge step backwards, kicking off a campaign to legalise same-sex marriage that will continue for more than a decade.
Cool.
Really cool stuff. Thanks, Labor.
Really good. Yay.
Thanks, mates. This is also the Play School fiasco. Do you remember this? The gay school episode? You don't remember this?
God.
So Brenna Harding, the actor who was in Puberty Blues and stuff, you might see her face. She's a fantastic actor. When she was a little girl, her two mums went on Play School. Play School did a feature. They went through the arch window to look at Brenna and her two mums. And this was a national story, right? People were losing their minds. There was a headline that read "Gay School."
That's actually pretty epic. I sent my kids there, gay school.
Please, yes.
Well, that's what they're all like now. All these public schools, they're all gay school now.
That's what they want. Tony Abbott said, if I'd been watching with my kids, I would have felt pretty uncomfortable. Like, John Howard goes on the ABC slamming Play School. It was like the dumbest culture war moment. And it just showed how fine we were. Don't worry, Labor stood up for what was right, of course. Labor, which has endorsed gay adoption, distanced itself from the broadcast. The party's family and community services spokesman, Wayne Swan, said, I haven't seen the program, but I'd be concerned if a children's program explored issues of sexuality because that's a matter for parents.
Exploring issues of sexuality. Just
I can't express to you how
on the screen.
Wholesome this story was. She's at she's out with her friend at a fair, and she's literally on like a merry-go-round on the back of a horse, just waving at her two mums. And her two mums are like, "Hello, our daughter, we love you."
So nice. Yeah. Disgusting.
Pretty gross. Michael Organ, the Greens MP, introduced a private member's bill to remove discrimination against LGBTQI plus people in all legal areas, including marriage. It was never debated, but the Greens kept up the pressure, reintroducing bills for marriage equality in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and through the ensuing decade. Thanks, Labor. Who was in power during those years? Was it the Labor Party?
Strange.
That's right.
I thought they were heroes for social justice.
Do you remember that being an issue when you go to school, like gay marriage being sort of a big thing? It was for me.
No. I was going to, I don't. And it's funny because I don't know if I've told you this before, but the reason I had a really shitty time at the end of primary school is because this girl that didn't like me spread a rumor that I was gay. I told this.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So I was like really hectically bullied purely because there was a rumor that I was gay, and literally I remember trying to walk from like my classroom to the bus stop and kids like yelling from the balconies, yelling Lezo at me.
Oh, Emerald.
So
this is in grade 6.
Yeah, I was in grade 5 actually when that was happening.
God. In the Northern Rivers.
In the Northern Rivers. It was a bit of a rough school. Okay. This was in Lismore, actually. But yeah, no, I was like, I'm not gay. Anyway, I thought I was completely straight at the time. But I remember I do remember trying to be like, but it's not right to discriminate against people, even if I was gay, you know, trying to explain this to the girls trying to like beat me up. But no, I wasn't aware that the Greens were in Parliament fighting for me.
Fighting for your rights. There you go. Yeah. You're welcome, little Emerald. But the 2004 election did not end up being about the Iraq War or gay marriage, but about interest rates. Oh, kill me. John Howard has said, who do you trust to keep interest rates low? Bob Brown, as usual, was hugely ambitious for the party and freely told reporters the Greens were set to win 1 million votes at the election. I have a feeling that this electorate's on the move, he said. There's very much a 1972 feeling about the place, but with a more confident and informed electorate this time and with more choices.
It's time for the Greens. That's 1972, right? That's Whitlam, 1972. Yeah.
Yes, time. Yes, big time. Yes, I mean, that was coming off the back of 20 years or something of liberal rule, as opposed to 8.
8? Yeah.
But yeah.
Still.
Bob and Kerry Nettle were up for election. They were hoping for Rachel Seward in WA, David Ristrom in Victoria, Drew Hutton in Queensland. These are all Senate candidates that people thought had a good chance. John Kay in New South Wales and Christine Milne in Tasmania. They were hoping to hang on to Cunningham, where Michael Organ had won in that by-election. They were having a real crack in Melbourne in the lower house. And a young Jenny Leong was running for the seat of Sydney.
Queen.
Against Tanya Plibersek, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, wow.
The Greens headed into the election with a well-rounded 170-page policy platform, a product of 2 years' development, which was boiled down to a 24-page booklet that was professionally printed and freely distributed.
Horrific.
How long are our platforms these days?
Well, we do we've done policy booklets that are long in recent years, but not 24 pages. And even those ones, some would say, are too long.
Right.
But I do love that they were just like, these are our policies. Should you wish to vote for them, have a nice day.
The system works. Give us 1 million votes, please. The end.
I have a feeling you will like what is in here.
Left-leaning University of Queensland economist John Quiggin described the party's economic policy as one of the most coherent and intellectually defensible documents of its kind ever put forward by an Australian political party. Wow. Comparable in rigour to the coalition's Fight Back document in 1992.
Okay. I haven't read the Fight Back. Yeah, I don't know about the comparison, but okay. You did say comparable in rigour, so not in substance,
in rigour,
of course.
In rigour. Anyone who decides to vote for the Greens on the strength of their support for the environment and opposition to war should be encouraged to know they are also choosing a party with a policy that is economically as well as socially responsible. Thanks, John Quiggin.
Thanks, John Quiggin. Yeah.
The Greens were turning respectable. With a campaign budget of more than $750,000, the party could suddenly even afford print advertising, if not on television.
$750, $1,000. What can that get you now? Nothing. God. Yeah.
Do we run TV ads much these days or kind of more online?
I don't think so, because I don't really think it's worth it. We do like streaming ads and you get your free ABC ad.
The what?
You know, every party gets a free, like a spot on ABC and they go, this is an advertisement for the Australian Greens. And then they play your ad. You didn't know this?
No. When's this?
Yes, it's a thing in election time. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Interesting. The Greens were heading into a storm, however, that would blow the campaign completely off course and undo years of hard work on the platform and strategy. The tone was set in the first week when Prime Minister Howard told shock jock John Laws that the Greens portrayed themselves as warm and fuzzy on the environment, but had a whole lot of other very, very kooky policies in relation to things like drugs and all that sort of stuff and new taxes and whatever, which people never talk about.
Drugs and all that sort of stuff and new taxes and whatever. My new album coming out next year.
I'm sorry, I should have done the voice. But had a whole lot of other very, very kooky policies in relation to things like drugs and all that sort of stuff and new taxes and whatever, which people never talk about, John.
It's good. Very good.
The next day, wow, this is crazy. This is so convenient. The next day, Melbourne's Herald Sun ran an expose, which led with the sensational claim that ecstasy and other illegal drugs would be supplied over the counter to young users in a radical policy framed by Senator Bob Brown's Greens. The article, which ran in the News Corp tabloids nationally, revealed other extraordinary Greens plans for Australia, including laws to force people to ride bicycles more often and eat less meat.
Yeah. We've never, just to be clear, the Greens have never had a policy about forcing anyone to eat less meat, right?
No, absolutely not. And
or ride bicycles
forcing
more
people to ride bicycles presumably is like just making it easier to ride bikes and maybe
more
not funding roads as much. Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
Driving farmers from their land, Medicare funding for sex change operations. Imagine. Capital gains tax on the most expensive family homes. The most expensive ones. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
An open door policy on asylum seekers. Fucking hell. It was repeated the attacks of the previous year's New South Wales election. Brown accused Rupert Murdoch and his minions of a get the Greens strategy.
No shit.
Well, yeah, clearly they're still using exactly the same bullshit.
It's exactly the same shit. Yeah.
Exactly
You think they're about the environment, but they're not.
I like this. The party soon complained to the press council. The very thrust of the story was wrong. The Greens' policy was for the decriminalisation of personal use of illicit drugs for a start, not the legalisation of trafficking or supply. The rest of the article was riddled with errors, with some claims downright fictitious, based on material directly supplied by the Liberal Party.
Yeah, source, John Howard.
6 months later, the Press Council upheld the Greens' complaint in what was reportedly one of its harshest rulings, criticising the Herald Sun for irresponsible journalism and finding the newspaper should have checked its facts with the party. Brown told reporters he had no doubt the story cost the Greens hundreds of thousands of votes and very probably seats in the Senate. It was all too late by then, of course. I mean, what a fucking joke of a news organisation and a system of regulation. This is just...
Well, this is the thing. And they know, and a massive organisation like that, like News Corp, know that they can afford whatever the repercussions will be after they have had the desired effect.
I don't know. What do you think? I've been thinking about this lately just for no reason. I've just had this little bit of interaction with the News Corp media. And you're just sort of like... How can anyone work? How can you sleep at night? How can you seriously say to yourself, I am doing journalism? And I'm sick of hearing all this, there are a few good ones in there. And I'm like, fucking quit, man. Get out. It's a shit show. You're working for Satan. You are literally doing the bidding of Satan.
You're literally working for Satan. Yes. Literally. It's true.
Literally. Emerald. Literally.
We mean that. Literally. That's right. Don't write in.
There was more. The tabloid hit job was followed in quick succession by attack ads from an unexpected quarter. In 2002, the TV network's industry body had decided it would no longer seek substantiation for statements made in political advertisements. Cool.
Good.
Brown had described the change as a disaster for democracy and general fears that Australian politics was being further Americanised. Come the 2004 election, the Family First Party, which had debuted in South Australia 2 years earlier with the election of Assemblies of God pastor Andrew Evans, it built up $1 million war chest and launched TV ads claiming the Greens were giving my kids easy access to marijuana. Brown got legal advice that the ads were defamatory, implying that he was actually handing out drugs to children.
He's a busy man, many hats.
Hello, kids. Do you want to get high?
Yeah, about him saying that and then inviting them to climb up into a tree for a tree sit to defend it from being bulldozed.
Would you like to smoke some Mary Jane? Do you party? The Greens complained to the Australian Electoral Commission. The Commission did not intervene, but the ads were subsequently withdrawn. Fantastic. In print, where the truthfulness of election ads had never been regulated, fundamentalist politician Fred Nile, who was running for the Senate in New South Wales, placed a Sydney Morning Herald ad headlined, Good News for Pedophiles, and subheaded, The Greens want to classify teenagers as adults, which would bring a smile to child abusers in every suburb.
Just kidding, satire. That is so fucking insane. Sorry. A headline, Good News for Pedophiles. Jesus Christ.
The Sydney Morning Herald. The Sydney Morning Herald.
Yeah.
Bastion of good journalism and liberal values or whatever.
Sure, brilliant. Yeah. And then I see, quote, Tasmania's forestry industry got in on the act too with ads attacking the Greens, not just over logging, but also over their policies on drugs and even vegetarianism. Again, have the Greens ever had a policy on vegetarianism? I just don't think that's even a real thing.
No. Well, this would predate all this, but like part of the anti-globalist agenda, I think there was some conference when, there was some literature about lab meat and then, of course, the conspiracy right. The eating bugs meme. Have you ever heard that?
Okay, yeah. Never actually really known where. Yeah.
Way further down the track, but yes.
Okay.
The idea that you could possibly criticize the meat industry both for its cruelty or its climate impact, making that criticism ipso facto implying that you want to shut it all down, yada, yada, yada. I mean,
yeah, right. And then everyone would have to be vegetarian. Gotcha.
Yes. Classic. All right, sorry, I'm taking too long here. But yes, turns out Labor and the Democrats did preference deals with minor parties on the religious right, notably Family First, that fucked us over in the Senate, which is pretty crazy. As Christine Milne points out, there was a Democrat senator who was gay, who was basically helping out Family First ahead of the Greens. Fantastic principle work there from the Dems. Thanks, Andrew Bartlett. And then this is interesting. Latham chose Greens' preferences over Tasmania's forest industry. Basically, he sort of went with the Greens vibe there to prove his green credentials, announcing an $800 million package to stop old-growth logging and retrain workers. That unleashed the fury of the CFMEU, and they organised a rally. John Howard was received by a rally of 2,000 forest workers in Tasmania, where people were yelling out, "You're the best fucking Prime Minister we've ever had."
That's fucking dumb. Come on, guys. Get a grip.
That is kind of bleak, you know. I mean, we've talked about the class interests and environmental interests, you know, being in tension. That's the story of Labor and the Greens for a long period of time. But even with that, you're going to go, come on, guys. Come on, CFMEU
John
members.
Howard, a Prime Minister for workers? Okay.
Yes. Like 8 years ago, got elected on policy smashing your industrial rights and is about to do it again. FYI. But. Anyway, according to Paddy Manning, it was arguably the moment Howard clinched the election, much more substantive than his infamous handshake with Mark Latham. Apparently was basically won and lost in Tassie there, I suppose, and with union support.
Okay.
The Greens lifted their national vote by 3% to 8%. We got screwed on those preferences, as we mentioned. Family First got up in Victoria with just 1.8% of the vote primary compared to David Rostrom's 8.7%. Insane. Terrible system. There you go. Rachel Stewart won in WA. Christine Milne, after a very, very long, drawn-out count, did eventually win in Tassie and became another Green senator there. In Queensland, it came down to Drew Hutton and Barnaby Joyce, for fuck's sake.
This was a star cast. It says it came down to Drew Hutton, who also Paddy Manning says was dubbed Queensland's greatest political loser. I don't know. I assume that's attributed to someone, but because he'd run like 10 times. This was like his 10th try. But it was him, Pauline Hanson, Hetty Johnston, the like anti-child abuse campaigner, and Barnaby Joyce. So I was like, wow, what a star cast.
Yeah.
And then, the counting went on for ages. Ultimately, Joyce won on fishing party preferences, which gave Howard control of both houses for the first time in something like 25 years.
Yes, which was a very big deal. They were very happy with that. And that's the thing that leads them to then go on and make work choices or pass work choices through both houses, which you would argue was sort of their undoing at the same time. They kind of bit off more than they could chew. But they got a little bit crazy, you know. They were the dog that caught the car or whatever.
Yeah.
Rolled it all out. The party was well short of its million-vote mark in 2004, and Brown feared the majority of voters want people behind razor wire. They want the East Timorese done out of their royalties. They want to see the drift of funding to the public sector away from the private sector. They want to see Indigenous Australians doing badly in the health stakes. That is a statement of Australia 2004. Incorrect, Bob. This is bad luck, my man. This is.
I mean, I understand.
Bad loserism.
I've spoken about. It hurts. Losing elections hurts, and you do feel really angry and sad about the electorate. So I understand, but yes, it's not the best way to frame things publicly.
Because it's like, that's not true. In order for that to be true, you sort of need to abide to the idea that the electorate read all the policy platforms and took a sober assessment of the various offers and then made their decision. And we know that's not how politics works. That's true. That's crazy. And if you think like that, again, that's like, where does that lead? Why bother doing anything? You have to believe that most people will agree with you on the big things, right? Because most people are all right. We got to hang on to that. It just sometimes doesn't feel like that.
Yes.
Democrats leader Andrew Bartlett blamed the Greens for Howard's re-election, likening Brown to Ralph Nader in the 2001 US presidential campaign. Bartlett said the Greens-Labor preference deal may have forced the ALP too far to the left for voters on issues such as forests. The Greens basically becoming the far left wing of the Labor Party has potentially pulled Labor too far to the left and left more ground for John Howard, Bartlett said.
Terrible take. Really, really stupid take, especially given the circumstances, which Paddy Manning goes on to explain. The result was that the Greens had increased their vote in both houses of Parliament, so clearly it's not a problem of them being too far left, doubled their representation in the Senate at the expense of who? the Democrats, who won none of the seats they were contesting and were clearly approaching the end of their 3 decades in Australian politics. I think,
and it's like, come on, like you must have. That's exactly what people would have said about the Democrats when the Democrats first emerged. For God's sake,
sure, you could,
this. How dare you participate in politics and make an offer and appeal to people and try and win votes? That's cheating.
Well,
You're not allowed to do that.
And it's an erroneous hangover of US politics where it is a zero-sum game effectively because they've got a shitty fucking voting system. Not the case here. Not the case. Like third parties and independents are not they're not stealing vote. They're not ruining shit for the major parties. Anyway. So, yes, like the Greens have increased their representation, but the problem is that Howard's got a majority in both houses, and so they effectively have no actual legislative, no like parliamentary power, which I guess is why they entered, I don't know, their stunt era, the beginning of Green stunts and their long tradition of quote unquote calling for things. Paddy Manning lists like the things, the things that the Greens were still able to do. But, sometimes you look at a list of Greens achievements and it's like called for this when they don't have like balance of power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bless. Like, and sometimes it is important to call for marriage equality a decade or more before it is actually legalized. That is still important to be in there standing up for people. But some of the things that they were doing, Bob got an urgent motion up calling for a rollout of non-sniffable opal fuel across the Central Desert region.
So did that happen, or the
I don't know if that,
was for the calling?
If it called for that. I actually don't know if then this rollout happened, but perhaps it did. It is one of those things, though. I think even if like everyone agreed on a Greens proposal like that today, it is so fucking rare that like the major parties would support a Greens motion if they don't have to, right? They would normally just like do it themselves and then try to avoid the Greens taking credit for it. Rachel Seward was the first parliamentarian to call for an inquiry into AWB Limited, formerly the Australian Wheat Board. Kerry Nettle, I like this one. I do like this one. Kerry Nettle wore a Mr. Abbott, get your rosaries off my ovaries t-shirt into the Senate during debate on the abortion drug RU486. Now, arguably cooler than Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, given that, as we know, she absolutely decimated rights and welfare payments for mothers that very same day that she delivered that speech. But yeah, so this t-shirt, first of all, I Googled this to learn a little bit more about the t-shirt and what Kerry Nettle was doing wearing it. 2 headlines come up in a row from the Sydney Morning Herald. 10 February 2006, Nettle apologises for abortion t-shirt. 11 February 2006, I'll wear ovaries t-shirt again, Nettle.
Fuck yeah, Kerry. You can get in there, mate.
These were shirts randomly produced by the YWCA.
Okay.
Apparently. But yeah, she was wearing this shirt and she was like, basically, I'm sorry if anyone, I'm sorry you feel that way, to anyone who was offended or misinterpreted the message to be, talking shit on Catholics, but that's not what it's about. And I would absolutely do it again. Apparently, pro-life campaigner Babette Francis tried to get these shirts banned, took it to court, saying that they discriminated against or they religiously vilified Catholics. But VCAT struck that one out. Not the case.
Another reminder that while we can make critiques of the left might be a little bit censorious sometimes or might be guilty of some spurious cancel culture accusations, I'm sorry. We don't have a monopoly on this shit. And overwhelmingly, censorship, shutting down free speech and expression has overwhelmingly come from fucking insane conservatives.
It's true. It's very true. So, yes, the Greens have, while that's happening though, they do have more senators than ever before. Paddy Manning says it had never mattered before, but the swearing in of 2 new Greens senators in mid-2005 raised a question. Should the 4-member-strong federal parliamentary party appoint a leader or carry on with Bob Brown as its unofficial national spokesman? Leadership questions. We're there, baby. I forgot to find, I did find, if anyone's interested, we did a deep dive on the leadership question, how the Greens leader is elected, in episode 57 on internal democracy. This is something that Tom and I have, we care about. I care about quite a lot. I wish that the Greens leader was democratically elected with 1 member, 1 vote. That is not the case. Unfortunately, hasn't been the case since this time, since 2005, when the senators adopted party room rules, which included basically a vote for leadership just among the members of party room and for other party room positions like the whip. Bob Brown at the time was, of course, he was elected as leader. I haven't included the quote here, but he comes out after being elected unopposed as leader and is like, it says something like, "We are a very happy and united party, and I'm very pleased." I don't know if
we
you
are
have
a very
this quote,
cohesive
Tom.
and happy group leading the advocacy of humanitarian and ecological policy on Capitol Hill.
Very good. It seems as though it was an issue though. They were not necessarily united. In fact, the party wasn't even united on whether to have a leader at all. This is the other question, not just how you elect a leader if you have one, but whether you actually have one at all. Quote, given the Greens' historical roots as an anti-party party whose motto was to do politics differently. Paddy Manning says, the debate over leadership came to a head at the party's national conference in Hobart that November. In an atmosphere described as bitter and contentious, the conference failed to reach a consensus on a leadership model, so Brown put it to a vote, and the right of the party room to decide its rules was ultimately affirmed. New South Wales delegates voted against it, according to Rhiannon, because limits on the powers of the leader had not yet been set out. They still haven't been, she says. The Greens New South Wales, however, accept the national decision to have a leader and have never tried to reverse it. 2 weeks later, Federal Party Room duly elected Brown as leader unopposed.
And so what do we've got leaders of the Victorian branch, leaders in Tasmania. There are no leaders in New South Wales or Queensland. South Australia seems
Queensland
to have
has a process for leaders. I think New South Wales doesn't necessarily.
Right, okay. So if you guys got enough MPs in Queensland, there would be a leader eventually? Okay.
3 MPs, 1 member, 1 vote, democratically elected. Queensland.
That's great.
Except that we thought we were going to get that last state election and we went from 2 MPs to 1.
Well, but the point is, if you did do that, then you'd have a very nice process.
It would have been a really good and democratic.
Oh, God. We are a happy and cohesive group. Michael
Michael is a very happy and cohesive MP. De facto leader. To be clear, I am not 100% sure. I can't remember if New South Wales, I think New South Wales doesn't have a process to have a leader, because how many MPs do they have?
No, I think it's a point of principle that they don't have
they don't have a leader. Mm-hmm. Which, again, I think we discussed this in episode 57. I don't necessarily agree with, but it's an interesting question. Interesting discussion.
The Greens of England, the English Greens, the Green Party in the UK have co-deputy leaders, I think.
Yeah, that's another thing. Yeah. The other thing that's going on, which you kind of alluded to, was the guns new pulp mill that was proposed in Tasmania. I don't know if we need to get into that a whole lot, but the kind of growing power of guns in the political landscape and them trying to wield their power manifested in this Guns 20 slap suit, the first slap suit, effectively. So within weeks of the 2004 federal election, Woodchipper Guns Limited filed shock legal proceedings in the Victorian Supreme Court, seeking $6.4 million in damages from 3 organisations: the Wilderness Society, Huon Defenders, and Doctors for Native Forests, and against 17 individuals, including the Greens' Bob Brown, who personally faced a $1.7 million claim, and Tasmanian leader Peg Putt, up for $1.5 million. The defendants were accused of disrupting guns logging business at protest actions from 1999 to 2004, as well as, quote, corporate vilification as part of an overarching conspiracy.
Corporate vilification. Go fuck yourself. Guns.
Go absolutely fuck yourself. The case would become known as the Guns 20, and it was Australia's first SLAP suit, which stands for, if anyone's forgotten, Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation Suit. SLAP suit.
SLAP
suit. Do you remember this? Were you aware of this kind of going on, or might have been a bit
Not
niche?
This particular suit. I mean, there's so much stuff to guns, and it will come up later in the book, I assume, because I do remember Peter Garrett being the Environment Minister and having to make a decision about the guns pulp mill, and so this issue will keep carrying on. And there'd already been a pulp mill earlier in the 90s, I believe, that Christine Milner played a big role in sort of fighting against. But yes, this particular case does vaguely ring a bell, and I remember it being quite a big deal. But it's crazy. It's so evil. The idea that a corporation could sue people exercising their democratic rights to protest against the environmental damage that they were doing. It's crazy. And wasn't there a moment in there where they sort of say like, yeah, let's take this to court, and someone being sued was like, yeah, let's go to court and argue over whether or not you've done damage to the environment. That sounds good.
Yes. Yeah,
and then
that's
eventually
right.
Guns is like, don't worry about it. It's fine. We'll leave this. Yeah.
Well, yes, but I mean, they persisted in various forms. Like, and it sounds like there was definitely a broad kind of recognition of just how significant this was as a precedent in Australian democracy. There were these very dramatic. I do love the retelling of super dramatic, like death of democracy style kind of protests. Apparently, yeah, Bob Brown was saying they were like jingling keys, which was a reference to the Prague Spring, which was like the Czech uprising. They would jangle keys at protests as a symbol of, I guess, like go home, but also give us our home and liberation and stuff. Paddy Manning is like, not sure about the equivalence given or the reference given. Many people died in the Prague Spring, but they were doing that. They were taping their mouths shut. I think Peg Putt and Bob Brown both had their mouths taped shut at these protests. Quote, 2 days after the writs were issued, the company announced that the site of its new pulp mill would be Bell Bay in the Tamar Valley. But ultimately, this slap suit and everything that they were trying to do kind of backfired in a way. You're right. Like, I think it galvanized support for the conservation movement. It prompted the introduction of new laws. Initially, Nick McKim introduced a similar bill in Tasmania. It ultimately became law first in the ACT that gave the courts power to strike out legal actions that were both unlikely to succeed and intended to prevent public debate. Also, the states soon afterwards adopted uniform defamation laws that prohibit companies with over 10 employees from suing for defamation, which I didn't know was a recent thing. I thought that was just always the case with defamation, that you can't sue.
I remember at Tonightly, they were like, guys, you can't defame the dead and you can't defame corporations. So
it's true. But
we were like, thank you very much.
I mean, you can injurious falsehood them. There is still like a legal avenue that's different to defamation, but it is still like if you talk shit on a company and it causes them damage. But I think might be a higher threshold, like there's a higher bar for it potentially.
I guess if you said, yes, Coke is putting human feces in their drinks or whatever, you probably can't do that. That's probably fair, I guess. But if I say, they are Satan as well, I think that's probably fine. That's fine.
That's true. Truth defense. I think that's how it works as a lawyer. Yes, so Gunn's first and second writs were rejected as, quote, embarrassing by Justice Bernard Bongiorno to the Supreme Court of Victoria. His overall impression was of a, quote, collection of very general allegations of wrongdoing by a large number of people over an approximately 5-year period. But even though those first and second writs were struck out, Guns effectively kept dragging people through various revised writs. They dropped it against like Bob and Peg Putt, but were going after others still. Ultimately, Bob Brown and Peg Putt did manage to get an order to recuperate more than $1 million in legal, it was $1 million, I think, ish, in legal costs. But still, $1 million in legal costs. I guess it goes to show that, like, if that was in whatever this was, 2005, these legal proceedings really are expensive. And in that way, I'm sure that they would be effective at shutting people up, because who the fuck can afford $1 million?
Yeah, and the process is punishment in and of itself. You don't need to win the case. You just need to tie people up in court for years and drain them of resources. And then they have to do a GoFundMe just to defend themselves and protect themselves from evil corporates like Guns or like Adani, for God's sakes. Yeah.
Of course, corporations barely need to do any shit like this anymore, because governments are just legislating to protect them anyway and banning any protest that might actually be effective. So that's nice, isn't it? Meanwhile, there were a bunch of state and territory elections happening over the next few years. The ACT and WA elections had somewhat disappointing results for the Greens. So in the ACT, the Greens went from getting 16% in the Senate at the federal election to just 9% in the territory election and 1 seat. In WA, the Greens had been in balance of power in the upper house for 4 years, had managed to work with Labor on a bunch of things like gay law reform in particular. They claimed they were the first to call for a strategic energy policy, which ultimately ended up being adopted as the WA's gas reserve decision in 2006. But then,
which everyone thinks is great these days. Like, remember when
extremely
power prices were going through the roof, except in WA,
everyone was
where
like,
they
"Why can't we be like
gas
WA?"
reserves. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the Greens.
It was the Greens. Greens win. But the WA state election comes along, and it seems like one of the big problems is this whole kerfuffle over WA's voting system. So this is like, it got slightly confusing for me. So at the time, votes were weighted in WA so that regional areas had 2 times the regular value in the lower house and 3 times in the upper house. And there were calls to reform this to make it 1 vote, 1 value, more democratic. But the Greens were split on this because a lot of their reps were from regional areas. Side note, like, I guess Paddy Manning explains that this is such malapportionment. It gives certain voters such a significant greater, I guess, voting power because WA is one of the most geographically centralized areas on Earth. You know, obviously it covers half of Australia, but almost 3/4 of the population live in Perth.
Yeah.
And so you give the regional areas a greater vote value. Like, it was obviously really heavily weighting their vote.
Because the downside would be that those electorates would be so massive, right? They would be so huge. In order to get the same number of people and voters within the same seat, they would have to cover an extraordinarily big geographic area, which they still do, at least at the federal level to this day in WA. It is kind of a massive disadvantage that those folks in those rural seats do come from. But that's probably worth it for the value, for the principle of 1 vote, 1 value, I'd argue.
Yeah. Well, it was kind of, I guess, and this is the argument, is that, you know, in order to ensure that rural and regional voters are adequately represented, for example, in the federal Senate, still, like, Tasmanian voters, I think in practice, their vote is worth more, right, because of the quota versus the population.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what the Greens were pushing for. Ended up making it 1 vote, 1 value plus an adjustment in the lower house. But in the upper house, they kind of made it even worse, where there were these 3 rural and 3 urban regions, and each have 6 representatives meant to, similarly reflect the situation in the federal Senate, but actually meant it was even more malapportioned. Interestingly, Paddy Manning says that this is probably the first instance where Bob Brown really heavily intervened on a WA decision. Apparently, he was making calls, he was whipping, he was really pushing for 1 vote, 1 value, obviously being like, this makes us look pretty fucking shit to be not supporting this plain move towards democracy, which is one of the Greens' 4 pillars, because it would disadvantage some of our representatives, right?
Yes, but then I guess he's doing that as a position of the leader of the party, having not been democratically elected by Greens members, and he's a federal leader of getting involved in a state election issue. I mean,
know.
You know, glass house is a little bit here, but I got to be honest. Yeah, I mean, I understand it. You know, it's all chaos and it's a small, and Bob Brown's important, and you know, at this stage of the party, it's, you know, him being involved is still a thing. But yeah, I mean, you would have to say this is a great example. If you want more democracy, Bob, then one way is to make sure that your leadership is democratically endorsed by the Australian Greens membership, and then maybe these kind of interventions would have a bit more weight.
Yes, but ultimately the Greens were stuck with the stink of the malapportionment and the kind of undemocraticness of it all without any of the benefit. The deal that they ended up with mostly benefited One Nation and the Nationals and not the Greens. Today, Giz Watson says the decision was a bad mistake. Quote, "It makes it harder for us to get elected in the council, which continues to be dominated by country conservatives. If I was to put my finger on one thing we shouldn't have done, that would be it." Womp womp. Bad mistakes.
Well.
Elsewhere in the country, things were looking a little bit better. Mark Parnell was elected to the South Australian Upper House, replacing the double rat Chris Hanna. So we discussed in the last Inside the Greens episode, Chris Hanna, who left Labor to join the Greens,
Yes.
right? And he was labelled a rat then. But then he left the Greens to run as an independent, making him a double rat. But yes, he was beat by Greens candidate Mark Parnell. The Greens also got a 4th New South Wales Upper House MP. They did well in Queensland with 8% and elected 3 MLCs at the 2006 Victorian election, which was following some reforms to the Victorian voting system, which introduced proportional representation to the upper house, which no doubt helped them kind of break through in Victoria. This is where things started to, Victorians start to emerge as a bit of as the Green state for the next little bit. Paddy Manning says, the 2006 election marked the beginning of the slow ascendancy of the Victorian Greens led by Greg Barber. Inspired by the anti-globalisation protests in Seattle, Barber decided to enrol in an MBA at the University of Melbourne while day trading to supplement the family income. Can I just quickly, what does he mean? You're inspired by anti-globalisation protests and then you decide to do an MBA and day trade? I guess he says, quote, it was almost like I was volunteering to be infected with the capitalism virus in order to develop a cure.
Very brave. I mean, I can understand an MBA. I mean, you may as well, an economics course is probably different, but I guess you could go into the belly of the beast, see what the fuck they're telling the capitalists to do. But but anyway, he's a pro-market environmentalist, apparently.
That's right. So Paddy Manning says Barber was a new breed of pro-market environmentalist. To the left radicals of the New South Wales Greens, these were, quote, neoliberals on bikes. Barber was a strategic thinker, however, who built up the Victorian Greens branch network and masterminded a heist on Labor's inner Melbourne local government stronghold. When he stood for the City of Yarra Council in 2002, he won a thumping primary vote of 47%.
Wow.
Becoming chair of the council's finance committee, Barber put his MBA to use. He fixed up the cash management and put more money into tree planting, bike paths, and a beefed-up open space program. Ratepayers loved it. The following year, the council elected Barber to the mayoralty, making him the first Greens mayor in the country. Vic Greens on the rise, Tom.
That is pretty impressive to not have like a majority of Greens members on the council and still get elected mayor.
It's wild.
Pretty decent achievement.
It's very impressive. Yeah. Mm. But yes, like it is that kind of, this is setting up the Victorian versus New South Wales Greens factions in a way, that the New South Wales are the Trots and the Victorians are the neoliberals on bikes. I don't know exactly where that quote comes from again. I think that Paddy Manning must attribute his quotes in footnotes, which I can never be bothered going to find. So someone said that.
See, that's funny. I would have heard that quote and thought, that would have come from a Labor left member. But no, it was from within the Greens.
It was probably from the New South Wales
shitting on each other within the party. Cool, man.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. There was a bit of drama in New South Wales with Bob Brown pressuring Lee Rhiannon not to run again with the New South Wales election coming up, not to run for pre-selection. Him saying effectively like that it would be hypocritical for Lee Rhiannon to run again because she'd campaigned on, or she'd pushed for term limits. She'd been in there for 8 years. But I think what Paddy Manning also hints at is that, or what Lee Rhiannon is saying is, it's because Bob Brown had his guy that he wanted to run in the New South Wales election, Ben Oaquist, and the idea being that he would run and then eventually he would go federal. Ultimately, though, Lee Rhiannon was resoundingly supported by members in pre-selection. But I do think, it's an interesting, again, and I think that this is somewhere in this chapter, Bob Brown himself is saying like, well, the Greens are growing, and I think as any party grows, you get little factions of sorts. And yes, you can see that probably on the one side there is like Bob Brown and maybe the more, the Sarah Hanson-Youngs and the Ben Oaquists and these people. And then there's the New South Wales Trots and people like Lee Rhiannon. And that would, of course, Lee Rhiannon's place in the party, I'm sure, will come up again as we continue reading inside the Greens. Also around this time, Labor in New South Wales initially had proposed selling their share of Snowy Hydro, which forced the Liberals at the federal level to follow suit. But the Greens were opposing the sale. This is, as I understand it, have there been multiple attempts to privatise Snowy Hydro?
I think there have been attempts to sort of privatize bits of it, but this is this was the big blow up. This was
the big one.
When it was really big. And I was researching this for the privatisation chapter of my book, and it's a lovely little moment in Australian history where it's just like, obviously by this point Howard had sold off shitloads of stuff, but at this point everyone was outraged, and John Howard was really taken aback by the amount of public support and outrage at the idea of selling off a national icon like that. So they're completely out of touch with what people want and expect.
Yes, and yet the Greens and the Democrats at the time were the only Senate votes against the privatisation of Snowy Hydro. So I guess, Labor must have supported the privatisation. What's interesting to me, and perhaps what goes unsaid in the Paddy Manning telling of this, is that there was also this backdrop of public outrage. The way that he tells it is like Bob Brown got legal advice that the sale of Snowy Hydro would be illegal. And then next minute, John Howard backflips, turns around and goes, actually, no, we're not going to privatise it. Perhaps it was some combination of illegal advice and the immense, public and electoral pressure. But again, Green's on the right side of history.
We love publicly owned stuff, please.
We love publicly owned
renewable
stuff.
energy. Let's maybe call it there, I reckon, if that's all right, just because we've been going for a while. There's so much to cover. These chapters are pretty massive, yes. But we will, briefly touch on the 2007 federal election before we jump into the next chapter of Inside the Greens. And hello to all the people who have waited for us to finish the book and are now listening through the entire thing and listening to this in 2028.
Yeah. Who's in government? What's happening? Is nuclear energy online?
Let us know. That'll be next time. We'll finish chapter 8 properly, and we will talk about chapter 9, Into Power. We are getting into the Rudd Gillard years. The CPRS may very well come up, everybody. We're very excited.
CPRS. There's got to be some sort of... I'm doing a thing with my hands.
And I believe Bob Brown will retire from politics. Much to look forward to. Thank you for supporting our show. We love you.
Sorry,
get in touch anytime.
Not to say that we're... there's much to look forward to because Bob Brown's retiring. As a friend of the show, we love Bob Brown.
We love Bob Brown. Just sort of juicy stuff to look forward to.
Yes.
We'll catch you next time, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.
Serious danger to Australia.